Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today we're having a really interesting topic. We're talking about clean versus dirty energy. Doug Hegren is going to join us in a few minutes. He's unfortunately running a little late, but we're just going to get started here. So let's dive right in. So this week, what we're going to be talking about is the big challenges with energy. Now, I want to start off kind of laying the groundwork here because I think it's really important to understand kind of what we're talking about to begin. I know, when you think about these issues, some issues tend to be a little contentious, this being one of them, right? People talk about the global warming or climate change. Some people say it's true, some people it isn't. But I wanted to get us all on the same page. So, here's Doug.
Technology, Kirk. It's your friend when it's your friend, and when it's not your friend, Kirk gets to be the only person anybody hears from. So I'm here.
Yeah, I was getting lonely, Doug. I was just hanging out there by myself. I was wondering, what if you leave me hanging or
Kirk,
early
I
weekend?
Kirk, I got to teach you how to how to be content by yourself in your lone time. It's good for you mentally.
I can't,
But of
man.
course,
I can't.
of course,
I
I know
grew up
you're
in the
not
era
alone
that's all
today.
we did. We were latchkey kids. I'm an Xer. I'm a Gen
That's
X. There's
right.
latchkeys. Like you're home by yourself. You're like, all right, what am I gonna do? I don't know. Figure it out.
Exactly. Exactly.
Don't drink the turpentine and don't stick your finger in the socket. But otherwise, we all survived. Oh,
Exactly. Of course, now we're having all these. Well, never. I won't get into all the other problems we're facing. Good to talk to everybody today, and sorry to keep you waiting. And I'm sorry you had to just listen to Kirk alone. I know that can be a little frustrating, but we're here. But now we're
we're
gonna
good now.
balance it out.
We're good now. All right. Well, let's get back to where we're going there. So, what I was talking about was kind of setting the stage for having this conversation to begin with, because a lot of people are on either side. And quite frankly, I think we're all in the middle. We just don't realize it. So, let's talk about kind of the bigger issues, right? So, you have the global warming or climate change issue. And some people think it's true, some people it isn't. But I think we all believe the same thing. We all want a cleaner planet. Nobody wants a dirty planet, right? We're all on the same page there. I don't care what side of the issue you're on, right? And whether you're pro or con global warming, doesn't matter. We all want a cleaner planet. We all want a planet that's going to last for future generations. So we all agree on the problem. What we don't agree on is the solution. And I think that is the part that we need to realize that that's where we're on different sides. Is the problem is acknowledged, the solution is not. Some people say we should, reduce carbon emissions. Some people think this. Some people think that we're overblowing it. I mean, I think the reality is the solution is really unknown at this point. There's no consensus solution, so we should just understand where we're all coming from to start. Now, I think we do need to also be empathetic for people on the other side, right? Like we think about politics, and we all agree that there are certain issues out there that need to be solved. But just like anything else, like people disagree on how to go about it. And that's okay, right? That's what makes good decisions. That's why, when you have a split government, that better decisions tend to be had because people are forced to come to terms with, all right, I'm being a little extreme, you're being a little extreme, but now we got to find some place in the middle that makes sense. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do here on this show is try to talk through what some of the bigger issues are and then try to figure out where can we find common ground. So, as we get kind of down that road, there's one thing I also want to talk about, which is, there's this talk with climate change or global warming that there's a consensus. Well, a consensus is not science, right? Science is not done by consensus. Science is done by putting together a theory and seeing if it can be disproven. If it can be disproven, then it's not true, right? People do studies all the time. Some studies are good, some studies are bad. And people point out the quality of the study. And if somebody can come out and say, oh, I disproved it, and here's how, then the theory doesn't hold water. And you have to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new theory. So anytime somebody says the science is already decided or there's a consensus, that's not truth. That's just politics. Politics is done by consensus, not science. So I also want to clear that because I think a lot of people get stuck on that and they say, well, I'm backed by science. Like I've heard a lot of politicians talking about it. The scientists are a different matter altogether. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because we'll be here for days talking about that science. But I do want to kind of address the bigger picture issues so we can kind of get into nitty gritty. And also, before we bring Doug on, I also want to bring up what are the big questions to ask? Okay. So this gets into the, which side are you on? This is where we're trying to draw a line in the middle. So the first question you have to ask about the energy issue, and I'll say the energy issue because the energy issue is quite broad, and it's not about the global. It's not about warming the planet. It's much broader than that. So, what is the problem? This is the first question you have to ask. What is the problem? The next question is it a problem? Right? Like some people they don't stop to think, well, is this actually a problem? Like sometimes the answer is, I don't know. Right? Is it a problem? Are we causing it? That's another question, right? We have to address, like, is this a problem that we are actually causing, right? Can we do anything about it? Should we do anything about it? And I know people object to that, but that is a rational question to ask. Should we do anything about it, right? And then would a solution possibly make things worse, right? There's always, in any sort of economic discussion, there's always give and take, right? If I'm doing this, if I'm putting more in here, I'm putting less in there. So is the solution worse than the initial problem? And then if we do something about it, are we exchanging or giving up? What are we giving up for that solution? So, a lot of times, I'll give you an example for this, and I'm not making judgment calls here. I'm just laying out kind of the framework so we can have this conversation here. Now, let's just say we all decide that, climate change or global warming is the most important issue in the world, right? Let's just say we decide that. Well, there's a finite amount of resources available in the world to address this issue, right? So if the resources are balanced between thousands and thousands of issues, let's say if we decide that in 10 years, the world is going to end if we don't do something. Well, that's pretty serious. So maybe we decide to take a lot more resources on this, but all that means is there are fewer resources on other things. So maybe we decide that poverty or, starvation are not as important, right? Maybe saving the world is more important. And I'm not judging. I'm just saying, let's pick an issue. We decide that this is less of an issue, so we're going to take resources from this and put into this. So there's always a balance, right? We don't live in a binary world where climate change or global warming is the only issue. There are multiple issues and resources will have to be taken from other things. So let's say we decide we're going to put $100 billion into this issue. Okay, where's that money coming from? Some other issue that other people also think is important. So I'm not saying one's more important than the other. I'm just saying that these are issues that we all have to decide together. And this is where politics comes in. This is where the consensus comes in, is where are these resources, where should they be distributed? That's where politics come in. Science is about whether something's real or not, and politics is about how we address it. So just wanted to kind of lay that framework before we begin. This is a public service announcement. Have you ever played the lottery? My state advertises that you can't win if you don't play. What they don't tell you is that the lottery is a tax on people who are bad at math. How many lottery winners have you met? Probably none. If you don't like your chances of winning the state lottery, you're definitely not going to like the chances of winning the inflationary lottery. The inflationary lottery? That's right. Your chances to win the state lottery might be 1 million to 1. But you're guaranteed to win the inflation lottery because it affects everyone. And the prizes stink. But here's what you're going to win. Higher prices at the store, shrinkflation in your packaged goods. Higher heating prices to heat your home. Who doesn't want to win that lottery? Much like the government, I feel bad that your costs are rising. So I want to help you out by giving you some free money. It's not a lot. It's only 1 million Zim dollars, but it's something. Well, you can't buy anything with it, but it does look good as wallpaper. And if you live in Europe, you might even be able to use it to heat your home this winter. If the lottery is a tax on people who are bad at math, then inflation is a tax on people who are bad at economics. I want my listeners to be better at economics. So I'm giving my loyal listeners free money. Go to www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. Follow the instructions to get your free money today. I have a large audience and a limited number of these currencies. So let's make sure we get yours before we run out. Go to www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. Follow the instructions and get your free money today. I do want to talk about what the biggest trends are. So, Doug, before I kind of get in, because I'm just going to go on a rant here, kind of what are your thoughts so far and kind of what we laid out in this framework?
Well, I mean, I'm good. Kirk, I think you've done it. I'm done. Everybody, I just stepped on to say hi and a good day. Kirk's got this handled. No, you know what this reminded me a little bit of, and I think getting into the framework of it, I mean, we saw over the last couple of years a lot of confusion about what science is, right? Trust the science. Okay. The irony is that science is based off of distrust of the science. The first thing somebody comes up with is as an idea, an observation that they believe, that they notice that there's something we can look into. The second step is research. The third step is hypothesis. The fourth step, which is basically throwing out what you think is going to happen. Then you experiment it. Then you analyze the data, and then you finally come up with a conclusion. But Kirk, is that where science stops? No. The actual way that science starts from there is then you publish it and you put it out there. I mean, to be a scientist actually shouldn't be the most arrogant position in the world. It should actually be the most humble position in the world. Why? Because the essence of science is to come up with what you think is an incredibly brilliant idea and then put it out there for public debate. It's kind of like Twitter before Twitter, right? Put out your idea and let everybody skewer the heck out of you. Because that's exactly how science works. It's always tested and always tested. And it brings me back to one of the greatest. If anybody wants to go back, and look at something for a comedic purpose, go back and look at the old Saturday Night Lives of Theodoric of York, the medieval barber. You remember that one?
I think so.
Yeah. Theodoric of York, a medieval barber, was a Steve Martin sketch played basically as a barber surgeon. Okay. And so I don't know, get a little bit of history, but when you look at barber poles today, why is there the red and the blue and the white on it? It is because although this seems like a joke, it is because that originally barbers were doctors, and there is the blue and the red is for veins and arteries. Okay. So they made a skit around this, which I hate to say is actually not as much comedy as real. Okay. He would come and basically talk to a sick family. Medicine is not an exact science. We're learning all the time. Just 50 years ago, they thought the disease was demonic possession. But now we know that it's an imbalance of bodily humors. Maybe it's a toad. Maybe it's a dwarf, right? And then he would profoundly start to talk about innovative ideas that had the potential to change the course of history, but ultimately he would dismiss them and come back to, oh, obviously the cure is bloodletting, right? And he'd end up killing his patient by bloodletting. This is what science used to be. And could you imagine if we left science to, we've concluded it, we're good, let's move on, right? That's not how it works. So I hate to say it. So every time you're getting your hair cut and those scissors are coming right next to your ear, realize that used to be a scalpel. Okay. So, there's probably a reason there's this natural fear that people get as they're snipping around. But going back to, bringing this, to the topic of conversation here. Okay. When it comes to energy and climate change, this is something that is going to be heavily debated. And you talked about obviously the finite limit of resources. I saw a video recently going back to one of the early days where Elon Musk was being asked about where energy would come from and why he was going to be doing Tesla and these cars and how they'd be created. And, and again, he didn't create Tesla. This is a myth out there. He ended up taking Tesla over, kind of like McDonald's and Ray Kroc. But they asked him, it's like, how are these cars going? Why are you doing this? Why are you going up against these big car manufacturers? And he goes, because there's nobody's doing an electric car. And he believed in electric. They asked about hydrogen fuel cell technology. And he personally, his hypothesis is that hydrogen fuel cells would never work. Right. And here we are. I mean, I know companies were investing tons of money in hydrogen fuel cells going back to a decade ago. There's still people working on it, but we have not seen that be able to be scaled at any level of economic value. Okay. So again, how much money can be put into the research? How much money can be put into the application of it? These matter. I mean, I was just talking to my daughter this morning about the band orchestra that the band that she's part of. Now, 2 middle schools in the same district. The other middle school is got, about 10 different trips they're going to be taking for their band. Her school's taking one. Same school district, same school board, same focus in learning. But what's happening? Well, one school doesn't have the resources to do what the other school does. And so it really has to come down to decisions. So that school is taking and using their money to do certain things that the other school isn't doing. And it really comes down to the same thing with energy. So when you start looking at where do people go, the key thing is you have to have the energy and you have to have it now. You can't even begin to transition without energy, right? It takes energy to create composites, energy to create synthetics. You've got to be able to have lithium to have batteries. You've got to be able to dispose that. You got to have the plastic casing from petroleum to be able to develop. Now, people could say, well, what about using plant-based plastics? Well, now you're pulling from our food sources, right? Plant-based gasoline and fuel is just meaning that more cornfields are being developed in order to create petroleum. So I look at this as something that, like you said, Kirk, is an incredibly difficult path to go down. And scientific debate and finite economic resources are going to continue to create what you have discussed already, the divide between what is it that we want to do and what is it that we actually have the resources to be able to do, and how quickly can we implement them. And I love one of the charts you've got, in one of the pictures you've got today, the source of power in every state. Like, every state has different resources, different access to the sources of energy, nuclear, hydro, coal, wind, natural gas. And what I found interesting is how many states are using coal in the western part of the country, where they've got real, real true geothermal uh, uh, sources of energy, right? If you go to Iceland, Iceland lives 100% off geothermal. Houses are heated by it. They cook with it. Well, I mean, I don't know, we have one of the biggest calderas, which is volcanic opening in the entire world, in Wyoming. So there is a ton of volcanic activity that's happening in the Western states. I found it really telling that they really weren't using geothermal as a major source of energy there, but it's there. Now the question comes back to why? Why has that not become a priority? And I think if you could see from state to state and country to country and region to region how much they're using differently for their sources, now imagine that conversation when you're talking country to country across the world.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this before we kind of move back to our kind of agenda with the problems. I thought this was a great chart, a great graph of or picture of the U.S. in each state. What's fascinating to me is if you look there, there's a whole bunch of coal and there's a whole bunch of natural gas, right? And of course, you look at Canada, it's mostly hydro. But what's fascinating to me is that if you're looking at these sources, this is what it is now, right? And a lot of people will argue about what's clean, what's dirty, which we're going to get into. But I think it's always good to visualize kind of where we are. So I want to kind of start the conversation with where are we now? Okay. So where are we now from an energy perspective? Well, where we are now is an enormous amount of our load power, right? Base load power. So there's a difference between peak power and base load power. Then, of course, there's other transportation energies too, right? Like you don't use wind to power your car, right? Unless you're on a sailboat. So you have to acknowledge the fact that there are certain limitations to our existing technology. Rightly or wrongly, you could disagree with the existing technology, but that's not relevant. What's relevant is what is it today? We have to acknowledge reality. The reality is we use gas to power our cars. We use, depending on where you live, coal or natural gas to power your electricity in your home. And there's certain things that are just the way they are. It doesn't mean they always have to be that way, right? We could say we want to have cleaner, renewable energy on our planet, which is it's a laudable goal, right? We should all acknowledge the fact that we would love to have a less of an impact on this planet, right? And I just saw a chart last night, which was hilarious. That you could take the total population of the planet and put it into a space like New York, and it would take up 1% of the planet's space. of the livable space, not the ocean, the livable space. So everyone in the planet could live in Alaska if they were living in a place like New York, if Alaska was New York. So I think it's interesting just to put things into perspective, because I think one of the things that we don't get is a lot of perspective. We get um, a lot of comments and claims like, "Oh wow, if this happens, then the world's going to end, and if this happens, everyone's going to die." And I think that type of comment is not helpful to move forward the technology. Now, where we are, so there's an aspect here which I don't particularly like, but I understand why it's happening. Now, what is happening is there's a lot of pressure, especially from wealthy people, wealthy institutions, from kind of the more green agenda, that we need to scare the pants out of everybody to get people to move. Because this is not the first time we've had a trend in the direction of cleaner planet, cleaner energy, and all that. It's happened decades ago and it didn't go anywhere. And I think what happened was people sat down and said, well, why didn't people do anything? Well, they weren't scared. Why do people make changes? Because of fear. We all know fear drives action. So I think, to me, it appears as if there's a huge amount of fear propelling people that the world is going to end if we don't do anything. And the world's not going to end if we don't do anything. But that is the fear that's being propagated. So there's a whole generation of kids who believe the world's going to end in 10 years if we don't do anything. And that's going to change the way they think about everything. Well, why should I do anything if the world's going to end in 10 years? Why should I care about a damn thing? Why should I do my homework? So I think there's a balance that has to be found. I think we all acknowledge that it's better to go in the direction of a cleaner planet, but it's always a question of how you're going to do it. Now, currently, we have a lot of dirty energy that is powering our infrastructure. Now, in a bull market like we've had for the last 14 years, since 2000, well, 13, since 2009, we've had a pretty much a bull market to 2000 and no, it's 12 years to 2021. So we had a bull market, that one of the longest bull markets that we've had. And what a bull market does is this: it allows, if you think about it this way, in a bull market, it allows companies and ventures that are not otherwise profitable to do to skate by, right? You think of all these companies that are junk, that are barely getting by, but hey, if I can borrow at 3%, even though I'm not making a profit, never have in my company, but I can borrow at 3%, I can extend this non profitability out another 10 years or 20 years. That's not really a recipe for success. It's a recipe for survival. So, if you think about it in that lens, in a growth, in a bull market, people have extra money and they say, hey, I've got extra money. I want to clean the planet. I want to do good for the world because I have more than I need. Great. That's awesome. Good for you. And so clean energy tends to do well in bull markets because even though it's not as profitable, and before some of you argue whether there's profitable or not, just acknowledge the fact that you needed uh, carbon credits, or you needed tax credits to make solar panels on your house affordable, because otherwise you'd never put solar panels in your house without those tax credits. So the fact was, it was not affordable in terms of like a balance of, am I going to use clean energy or dirty energy? So it didn't make sense to pursue clean energy because it was too expensive. So the point was, is in a bull market, you can get away with that because the government says, well, we get extra money. Let's do some tax credits and let's make it reasonable. Okay. And then it allowed technology to progress. It allowed the cost to go down. So then people were like, well, no, we don't really need the credits. Well, you do, but it's getting close. So I can make that discrepancy. However, dirty energy is still cheap, right? You got coal and natural gas. Well, natural gas is not really necessarily dirty, but it's hydrocarbons. So, coal is still cheap, and natural gas kind of fits in this clean slash dirty category. It's clean, but it's hydrocarbons, which people don't like. Um, it's still cheap, and that's still going to be the primary source of energy, because when you go into a bear market, and this is true. This has always been true, right? In a bull market, certain things do well. In a bear market, other things do well. You know what does well in a bear market? Dirty energy, alcohol, tobacco. Sin stocks, gambling. Those do well in a bear market, and that's always been the case. because they're reliable. People need them. People need to eat. They need to, they don't need to drink, but they do. People feel like they need to smoke. So all those things do well. Whereas some of these high flying tech companies with no profit don't do well. So the best environments for a clean energy environment is a bull market. And, I think we've seen this year, we're not in a bull market anymore. And you could argue that point, but I'll say we're not in a bull market anymore. And you're just going to have to deal with my sentiments. And I think we're in a bear market, and we probably will be for quite some time. So if you take that acknowledgement, you have to realize the fact that we're not going to be putting the same amount of resources into clean energy because people need to make a profit. They need to put food on the table. So that trend is going to not reverse, but it's going to, let's just say, sit in the sidelines for a little while until the next bull market. Now, Doug talked about finite resources. We have a world where there's a finite amount of resources, and we're all fighting for them. If you think about all the wars that have happened, they've been over resources. It's not over who has the best view of the mountain. It's, hey, you've got more resources than I do, so I want your resources. And it's easier for me to, kill a bunch of your people and take them than it is for me to mine them myself. So a lot of wars are fought over resources. You could make an argument whether Russia and Ukraine war is over resources, but I would argue ultimately it is, because you've got these enormous energy producers and Ukraine food producers that are now fighting each other, and the resources aren't flowing to the way they need to, which means higher prices. So a lot of the challenges that face us in the years ahead are going to be over resources, energy being a main one. Who gets to control them and how much is left? And at some point, the non-renewable resources are going to run out, and then we're going to be stuck. Now, I will say this in terms of trends. Back in, I think it was 2005, 2006, there was a big theme of going on of we're going to run out. We're going to run out of energy. We're going to run out of oil. We're going to run out of gas. We're going to run out, and then we're screwed. And so energy prices went through the roof. I mean, gas, coal, natural gas, all of it. It went through the roof. You go back and look at the price charts. I don't have them in front of me, but they just went through the roof because people assume that we're going to run out. Well, what happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. They discovered fracking. I don't know if they discovered it. They rediscovered fracking. And a guy went out there and fracked an oil field and discovered that, hey, I'm getting a lot more oil and gas out of this field. And now all of a sudden we have we went from, we're not going to have enough to, we're one of the largest, we're, I think, the largest producer of natural gas in the world. And we're one of the largest producers of oil if we were able to pull it out of the ground. Now, our government doesn't necessarily want us doing that because they've had policy against that. But the point is we have a lot of energy in the US. And that changes the balance of power in the world because people are fighting over resources. So if you understand these major themes and big trends going on, it makes it much easier to understand these small skirmishes. And I don't mean to minimize the Ukraine war as a small skirmish, but it's a small skirmish. We're not having a World War III at the moment, or some people could say we're starting it, but currently we don't have World War III, so it's a skirmish, right? It's a small battle that hopefully will not turn into a big war. But all of these themes come together as to understanding where energy is going to go. So the theme that you need to understand is energy demand is not going to decline. It's only going to increase. And the battles or skirmishes over that energy are also going to increase. So what are your thoughts, Doug, before we kind of get into some more of these points?
Well, a couple thoughts that came up. First of all, just looking at fracking, it has been around for a while. The first hydraulic fracturing began as an experiment in 1947, first commercially successful in 1950. But it is not. If you think of if you think of There Will Be Blood, for example, the original oil wells, right? Just drill that hole right into the ground. You'll tap a big pool of oil and suck it out. And that's how most oil historically has been extracted. And that is, of course, fairly inexpensive, right? Hit it with the hypodermic needle, pull it out. Fracking is one of those things that is necessary because the most oil in this planet is not in big pools. It's actually integrated in shale because shale is a compression of biological material. So it's really expensive to go after. So at times, until they could make that technology a lot cheaper, or the oil prices were more expensive, it was much more difficult and much more costly to go after. So it was really ignored until recently. Going back to kind of what you were talking about the battles that people have. Actually, there's a gentleman, you may have heard of him, Kirk. His name is Charlie Munger.
Yeah, I've heard of
Charlie,
him. Yeah, a
yeah,
little
might have
bit.
heard of him a little bit. The lesser half of another guy named Warren. I forget what his last name is, but Mr. Buffett and Munger have done pretty well for themselves. He has a quote: "It's not greed that drives the world, but envy." So if you take a look at what people are, what really pushes our world forward, it's not that people want more. It's that they want more of what somebody else has. Okay. And that is a tremendous, and there's always going to be someone that has more than you. Even to this day, with Elon Musk as the wealthiest person in the world, he's not arguably the wealthiest person in history. And eventually he won't be the wealthiest person on the planet. Somebody will overtake him. But people that go to battle, Putin wanted something from Ukraine. It wasn't greed. It was envy about stuff that they had. It was frustration about something they had. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics of exactly what, but most conflicts are because I want what you have, and I want it for myself. So, where we have what's driving green energy versus dirty energy, we'll just use it for the sake of the show. You can argue what you want about those definitions. It is envy. They want something the other side has, whether that's power, whether that's control, whether that's the energy for the power. It's whether that's, being able to take over market size, because there is a business in green energy, right, Kirk? Would you say
Yep.
that there's money to be made? Lots of money to be made. Is it efficient money? Well, that remains to be seen. And I think that's just like you talked about. When there's easy money, then it's easy to go after technologies that are not profitable and use that as a way to create something that wasn't there before. Okay. But now, when things get more expensive and it gets harder to tap that ground, or it gets more expensive to borrow money to create these new things, and you can't just, I mean, what do we don't want the world to end, right, Kirk? That's, I think
I
everybody
don't.
would agree. Everybody would
I'd like
agree.
to wake up tomorrow.
Like to wake up tomorrow. So the argument about green energy is that we want, especially this fear that's being put in there. And I like what you said. If you put too much fear, people get paralyzed. Like you said, what's the point in showing up and going to school tomorrow? What's the point of even trying? We're all going to die anyway. So if they keep throwing out this rhetoric that once we pass this course, we're done, it's not a beneficial argument anymore. It's absolutely, well, we can slow down the problem, but the problem's already there. So what the heck? And I won't be alive to see the end. So forget it. It's, so a lot of these arguments create more problems than they solve. But if we go back to the energy, the goal of green energy, you may be worried, if you believe in one side, that the world is going to end because we are not going around the right path of energy. But what about dying tomorrow because you freeze to death in the middle of winter? That's a little bit more of a time-sensitive priority. So if all of a sudden green energy is no longer subsidizable, or fracking is no longer affordable because oil prices fall too much, something we kind of saw in 2020, right? Why did all of these wildcatters start going out of business? It's because they became so efficient at what they were doing. They drove the price of oil down to unsustainable levels. And all of a sudden, it was no longer supply and demand affordable to continue that technology. The same thing happens now. If it's unaffordable, if we have to wait for green energy, but you need to heat your house tomorrow, you're not going to wait 10 years for affordable green energy when you can turn on heat in the house right now, because while the world may end, your life will end sooner. And I think that's the battle that's going on in a lot of these arguments about, and Africa. We've seen the president of Uganda come out and say, look, why do you want us to be green energy when the hypocrisy is that Europe, you didn't start that way? Well, let's go back to the map we looked at earlier in the show. Even in the United States, we're not using green energy predominantly as a first world country. How can we expect other countries who want to develop and become economies of scale, which their people only care about their families, their country, to get there in a different path that's more expensive than the path that first world countries and predominant, were able to take back in their early days to get where they are today. Because that becomes a situation where those that have continue to have, and those that don't have continue to don't have. And that's just, and that, what does that lead to? Envy. And that leads to conflict.
So you raise up a lot of great points here, Doug. I want to touch on some of them. So one of the points is if you think about policy decisions, right? Policy decisions in the U.S. is one thing, but policy decisions globally is a totally different thing. And what you brought up was one of the main points. So we just had on I just interviewed an energy expert, Abi Rajaneran, and he'll be. I think the episode's coming out on Wednesday next week. So those of you who are listening to it live, it'll be out soon. Really knowledgeable guy. But one of the things we talked about were policy decisions, right? So we make policy decisions in the US. We make them in the developed world, right? You think of COP 26 or whatever it is. You think of these groups that are making global policy decisions on energy, and you've got the developed world, which has a lot of resources and a lot of technology, and then you've got emerging markets or even frontier markets, which are very backwards in the sense of where we are in the developed world. And we're telling them, hey, you need to stop burning wood because you're killing yourselves in your house. You need to start using solar energy. Now the sentiment is correct, right? Like they're trying to help them, but these are people who they're not burning wood because they're wealthy. They're burning wood because that's what's next door. They can cut it down and they can heat their house. Now there's a huge problem with people dying early because they're inhaling the particulates after they're burning wood in their house, which is, to us, it's like, what are they thinking? But that's the way of life. That's the culture. That's the way people are. So you can't just take our framework on the world and say you need to do it our way. So what's happened in a lot of these countries, especially in Africa, is we're going down there telling them you need to be clean. You can't burn dirty energy. You can't do this. And they're like, yeah, but you've been doing it for decades, and now you're telling us not to do it because you woke up and decided it's a bad idea. I said, we can't do it. You're going to ruin our economy. Oh, and to make it worse, then Europe comes back and says, oh, yeah, by the way, we're at war with Ukraine. Do you mind producing some of that dirty energy for us? Because that's all we have. And they're like, you're a bunch of hypocrites. So you pretty much have anybody outside the developed world who's looking at us like we got our heads on screwy because, we all want this ideal of clean energy. We all live in the woods and everything's sunshines and rainbows, but that's not reality. The reality is today we have the capacity to use dirty energy to run our economy. We do not have clean energy to run our economy. We do have it, but it's not enough. And Doug, you and I sent out that meme, or it wasn't even a meme. It was just an image of California. Day one, it said, in the next 5 years, everyone's going to have electric cars. The next day, there was another tweet by some other agency, and it said, please do not charge your electric cars. We don't have enough electricity. That's a day apart with the same government. And so there's an obvious divide. Abi called it the great transition, right? The transition from where we are now to where we need to be. And that transition is going to be painful. It's painful because we right now have certain capacities to run our economy. And if we screw that up, right? You think about the supply chain that we had and those problems that we had because of COVID, that screwed up the supply chain. It's going to take 5 to 10 years to fix that. But we can do that because I don't need another set of boots. I don't need a third tie. Like I can get by without certain things. Life is going to go on. Life is not going to go on if you don't have energy. Now, I live in Boston. Doug lives in another part of the world, which is colder, I think, than Boston. Up in Minnesota, I think it's colder. I'm not sure. I think you're a higher latitude.
I got frostbite this morning just getting out of bed, I think.
Okay. All right. So you're in a colder area. We haven't even seen our first frost yet. So so basically, if you look at it that way, think of it this way. Like Boston, I'm going to put up a chart here because I think it's really telling. So this is the cumulative generation capacity of New England. Okay. Look at the chart. The light blue, which takes up 90% of the chart, that's natural gas. Boston's infrastructure runs on natural gas. Next is wind. We don't have a lot of wind production here. I don't know where that comes from, probably another state. Then oil, then nuclear, biomass, fuel cell, hydro, and solar. Solar's down at the bottom. So I point this out just to show that natural gas is an enormous amount of our needs to generate electricity. Now, there's some people who've come out and made a claim that Boston is going to run out of natural gas this winter and that we're going to all freeze. There's going to be a blackout of energy and people are going to freeze. Well, when you have 90% of your electric capacity based on natural gas, and then you have a Russia Ukraine battle, and all the natural gas is going to Europe so that they don't freeze. Oh, and by the way, we have a huge amount of natural gas in this country, but our politics say, yeah, we're going to stop that because natural gas is bad. We don't want you to frack that because it's bad. And that's all based on a documentary, which is proven to not even be true. So, you look at these things, you say, the politics are a bunch of screwy people making screwy decisions, and it takes a crisis, which if this person's claim is correct, and that we do have a blackout in Boston because we run out of natural gas at a time where we need it, then all of a sudden the wheels are going to go into gear and people are going to say, oh, it's because of climate change, it's causing these problems. It's not because of climate change, it's because of politics. Politicians making stupid decisions to try to produce their own outcome, which to me just means these people ought to be drawn and quartered in the streets because they're putting politics ahead of people's lives. Now, what I wanted to get to with some of Doug's comments with the impact of policy decisions is this: it's all really well and good to want a cleaner planet and to green the planet and to use clean energy. I'm all for that, but not for the sake of the short term and for practical uses. Because what that means is the policy decisions that are in place now are deliberately in place to make dirty energy more expensive than clean energy. It's not to reduce the price of clean energy, it's to make dirty more expensive. Think about the absurdity of that statement, right? It's like saying you're going to the gas station, you're like, I don't really like that guy, but he's got the cheapest gas, and it's like, well, I could talk to the neighbor and say, hey, why don't you reduce your gas? But like, no, I'm going to go blow up his pump, so it's more expensive. Like, I mean, just the absurdity behind the decision. That's not how economics work. If you want to compete, you do it cheaper. The reason it's cheap is because it's established, because we have the infrastructure, because of so many reasons. Eventually, clean energy will get cheap enough. And actually, we do have a lot of clean energy that's cheap enough. Natural gas is a clean energy and it's cheap. It's probably the cheapest and most abundant and energy. And it also has the best infrastructure. It's the most stable. So nuclear is another one which I've been talking about a lot. We don't have the same infrastructure. It takes 10 to 20 years to put together a plant. There's a lot of issues there, but natural gas is here today. And then you
Kirk.
have hold on. You have politicians out there saying that natural gas is a bad thing and we need to stop it because it's ruining the environment. And that's what that does is that creates a problem. Here's the problem. Poor people aren't going to make more money. So if you're trying to increase the cost of electricity and energy, then you have to give poor people more money because they're not going to have enough money to heat their homes and to drive their car because you're trying to make it more expensive. So you're caught. It's they call it the law of unintended consequences. So you're trying to green the planet against the free market, and it causes poor people to run out of money and freeze to death. So if you really want to get mad, the poor people are the ones that should get mad because they're the ones that are going to get stuck with this, and people are going to be complaining and having torches and pitchforks in the street, and the politicians going to say, hey, we didn't do it. And it's going to be exactly them. They're the ones that cause it. So go ahead, Doug. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to kind of add on. What's interesting, if we go back to one of the first maps we looked at, the number one source of energy in each state, and you mentioned natural gas in Massachusetts, also Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, District of Columbia, all use natural gas, Virginia, natural gas. Maryland, interestingly enough, nuclear, New Hampshire, nuclear, Maine is hydro. But what was interesting is not on either of the maps that we looked at, and this comes from the United States Energy Information Administration, the EIA. What isn't listed there is because we're talking about energy that's probably burned or how they're creating electrical energy, right? And we need electricity to run the things, but electricity Electricity can run your heat. Electricity can run your power, your turbines, your lights, all that stuff. But certain places, they actual direct heating comes from natural gas or electricity or other sources. And what was not mentioned in there is heating oil. So residential heating oil has been declining, but the stronghold in 2020 and 2021, about 5.3 million households in the United States used heating oil as the main space heater, and 82% of those households, Kirk, guess where they're located?
Well, I have heating oil, so I'm going to guess New England.
The Northeast, absolutely. Number one is New York, and number two is Massachusetts. Three is Pennsylvania, four Connecticut, and five Maine. So when you start to think about the combined, and there was actually talks of heating oil shortages that were mentioned for last winter. I haven't seen what they look at for this winter, but there is a massive, massive amount of energy needed direct heating. So not electrical production, but just to try to keep the house warm. Now you start adding, again, another energy that is not a clean energy that is built into the infrastructure of the Northeast. That is not easy to remove. It's expensive to remove. It's expensive to redefine. And I like what you mentioned about the impact on the poor, because here it goes back to the conversation that you mentioned about that we talked about, the electric car goal that California and other places have put in. If the electric cars right now are 50, 60, $70,000 or more, right? And there's a mandate to make everybody get nothing but electric cars in the next couple of years. Now, the law of economics says that at some point, the more that something's produced, the more that price will come down. Now, that's straight, that's straight capitalism, but that, commoditization, but that is not how things really work. It can take decades for those prices to come down, because it doesn't mean that all the costs that go into developing it are coming down. So what you're basically saying is that after a couple years from now, anybody that needs transportation, and outside of where you live, Kirk, people need transportation. Public transportation is atrocious in most parts of the country. Okay. Again, another subsidized thing they're trying to put in. Light rails are going into these major cities. Nobody lives near the light rails. Okay. So that's a problem, because then you got to get to the light rail. So they build big parking lots that you can drive to get on the light rail. Well, here's the thing. Your car breaks down. You need a new car, and you're making 15, 20 an hour, maybe $50,000 a year or less. How are you going to afford a $50,000 electric car? Okay. So you're going to go out there and you're going to try to buy the cheapest car you can. And that, because people don't think about the long-term cost. People like to talk about, well, that electric car, I'll never have to buy gas again. But you buy gas based on monthly paychecks. And yes, you get squeezed when it is $100 a tank. But $50,000 out of pocket to never have to pay for a tank of gas again, it takes years to make up the cost of all of those tanks of gas to make up for a $50,000 car, when you can go buy a beater for $5,000. Okay. So it's, again, the law of unintended consequences. The majority of people in America make less than the top 50% of earners in America, and they can't survive a rapid transition. Now you go to places in the world like Africa, if you've ever seen third world countries, a lot of them have the cars the flooded cars from our hurricanes. Guess where they go? South America, Africa. These are cars we won't touch, but to them, it's transportation, and they don't care how dirty it is. They have to make it work and get from point A to point B for their economy to survive. And they are not going to be thinking, wow, can't wait to fix this problem in 15, 20 years.
Yeah, so let's kind of go through some of the energies and talk about the big transition, because I know we got some limited time here. So, if you think about the different types of energy, right, and they have different usages. Mainly, the energy is used for transportation, industry or manufacturing, or building use. Right, those are the main sources of energy that we use. Right, building use includes like electricity, heating, things like that. So those are the main uses. But really, you've got a few different types. You've got coal, which is cheap but dirty, right? And people don't like it, but it's cheap and affordable. It also is really good for baseload power, because we've got a ton of it. Gas, natural gas, is cheap, it's clean, and it's stable. So you can pipe gas into your house, and it's there's a stable infrastructure there. and it's probably the cheapest and the most abundant energy source we have in this country. Then there's nuclear, which is cheap and it's clean and it's load power, but it's got this negative stigma attached to it, which is unfair because the negative stigma came from decades ago and technology's advanced. It's like saying those cars, they'll still fall apart on you. Those horses, oh wait, we're not driving horses anymore. Okay. It's nuclear we had a guest on the show a few years ago who was one of the experts in nuclear. He's talking about Gen 4 and how so far advanced it was from Gen 1. And it's actually a big problem because people are trying to take nuclear plants offline at the exact wrong time to do that, which we'll get to if we have time. And there's wind, which is also pretty cheap, but it's not scalable. Look around here. We have our I call them limousine liberals. People that are out screaming in the streets about clean energy, and then you try to put a wind farm in Nantucket, and they're like, no, 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 that's going to ruin my view. We can't put that here. We'll put that somewhere else. These I call them limousine liberals. John Kerry is a famous limousine liberal around here. It's all good for other people, but not in our or not in my backyard. Liberals, as I call them. So wind is cheap. It's not scalable. It requires a huge amount of space, and it's not load power because it relies on wind, and the wind doesn't blow every day. Solar, same thing, but solar is expensive. It takes up a ton of space. It relies on the sun, and it's not load power. So solar, while it's getting cheaper and there's a lot of benefits to solar, we're not there. We're not even close to where we need to be for solar to really kind of take us where it needs to be. Plus, you got the fact that it takes up all this space for solar panels. So you're just going to have a ton of extra panels around, and that's a problem in itself. Then you got geothermal, which is actually one of my favorite clean energies. The problem is you really have to be near the Earth's crust where it's thinnest. So you have to be near these near the tectonic plate zones. Like Japan's on one; they could do really well with geothermal. Iceland, you mentioned earlier, geothermal is good there. But you can't just put it in like the middle of Arkansas. Like it's not going to work because you'd have to drill too deeply to make it work. So it's really good. It's cheap, but the technology is not great. It's the tech's. There's not a lot of interest in it. The tech's kind of questionable. But it's one of those things where I feel like there's so much potential there. If they could do it right, geothermal would really make a good impact. And it's renewable. It's clean. It's cheap. So that's something I like personally, but nobody seems interested in that. And I can see why. It's hard to scale that. And then biomass, but biomass isn't scalable. You got to, you could look at it. It's one of the smallest amounts of renewable resources we have in energy is biomass. So while it's interesting in of itself, I also think it's not really a scalable source. It's nice in your house, but otherwise not great. So getting back to the big transition, right? You have this divide between a free market and a command economy. Free market is letting the market decide, what's going to win. And if you make things expensive enough, the free market will fix it, right? But if you do price fixing, which is what they're doing over in Europe right now with electricity, saying, "Oh, we're going to fix the price," well, that just causes shortages. So, if you don't have a free market, then it's not going to find the equilibrium that you need to have the cheapest prices there around. Now, getting into the big transition. So we talked about it. Really, we need to go from a period of consistent load power. So that's one of the mandatory requirements of changing over the energy. We have to find resources that are consistent load power. You can't have these flimsy clean energy like solar or wind because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't always blow. So something like nuclear, you always have nuclear. It's going to continue on. That's what we call load power. It sustains the grid regardless. And right now, one of the big problems is we're underinvesting in dirty energy, specifically oil and gas. So the fact that we're underinvesting means that, well, today we might be fine, but if we underinvest, eventually we don't have any more infrastructure because people stop reinvesting, right? You drill a well, you spend $1 million to drill a well, then you pull the oil out, maybe you pull out 10 million of oil, and then you go take some of the profits and you go drill another well and do the same thing. The problem is right now we're not reinvesting in infrastructure because the big oil companies are being told by the politicians that, screw you guys, we don't like you. You have to go. Someone in changed the board of ExxonMobil and tried to make them a green company. You're going to blow up our economy, our infrastructure. We're not going to be able to run our infrastructure. We're going to have shortages, blackouts. We're going to have all this because we're not reinvesting back into the infrastructure. Now, just because you want to be green in 10 or 20 years doesn't mean that you just X out all of this whole energy complex, because you can't, because it's still, you still use gas to drive our cars. Yeah, eventually we might be electric cars, but I don't know when that's going to be. 10 years, 20 years. I mean, can I take a trip up to, up to Canada, and it's going to take 5 hours to recharge my car? Like that, some of these things aren't always as practical as you might think. So under investing in infrastructure is really important, and that is one of the biggest problems. When I say we're all screwed, and it was a little hyperbolic, but the reason that we're screwed is because you have things like under investing in our infrastructure. You look at like Venezuela, right? And some of these other banana republics. I'm trying to think of one offhand who did this. I think it was Venezuela, where they just kept under investing in their infrastructure. They kept taking the profits and lining their pockets, and then eventually you don't have any more wells, and you can't drill more wells because you have no money. So then other people have to come in and drill them. So you go from a sense of ownership to, all right, we're going to lease our space out to other people because we can no longer afford to do it ourselves. So the underinvestment in our infrastructure is going to screw us all. And if we don't come up with a plan to address that, then we're going to have some issues. So a good example of this, Biden came out a while ago and scolded the oil companies for their high earnings and accused them of gouging motorists. And they want to do an excise profit tax on energy companies, which is probably the worst thing you can do, right? You think about it. But the reason that they're underinvesting, the reason that they have so much profit is not because of high energy prices. The reason they have so much profit is because they're underinvesting in CapEx, which is basically drilling new wells. So they're no longer drilling new wells because they're being told, hey, if you drill new wells, we're going to make it unprofitable for you. So they're taking that profit and giving it to shareholders and saying, here, we got all this extra profit, you take it. And the politicians are like, well, you can't do that. You're making too much money. And it's like, they leave it to the politicians to not understand economics. But if you make it hard for them to reinvest, then they're going to give it back to shareholders, which is great as a shareholder, but it's terrible for our economy long term. And what that means is our energy costs are going to go through the roof. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen. So we're not going to see low oil prices again unless we have another COVID where the whole world shuts down. It's just not going to happen because that's not what the economics look like with the supply and demand. So that is one of the biggest challenges we have, and it is solvable. All they have to do is just kind of reverse the course and tell them, say, hey, we want you to have we want you to be carbon free by 2030, or I'm sorry, 2030. I keep forgetting what year I'm in. Like 2050, and make it reasonable, right? And say you've got plenty of time to convert your company into something else. But if you're saying don't reinvest, I wouldn't reinvest either. It's not profitable. If I know I put $1 million in the ground and I can only get $500,000 back, why would I bother doing that? And that's what they're thinking. So the big transition is a lot about transitioning from dirty to clean, but it's also about transitioning our infrastructure and making it to the degree where we don't have an energy shortage, and then we get into these skirmishes or wars over energy. I mean, how would you think about the U.S. secretly trying to, destroy Russia because they've got a lot of energy that we want? Like, I wouldn't stand for that. I don't care who's in office. That's ridiculous. We shouldn't be invading other countries for their energy. But, if you destroy the infrastructure of one of the biggest sources of natural gas in the world, just imagine Saudi Arabia. Here, let me show this picture because Doug, you sent this to me. I want to show it. It was great, and the picture was perfect because of the World Cup. It looks like a soccer ball. This is Saudi Aramco. And this is the biggest oil company in the world, $2 trillion. ExxonMobil is like the second, and it's like a speck compared to that. Imagine if Saudi Arabia just said, you know what, we're going to stop producing gas. Screw you all. We're done. We've got enough money. We don't need the headaches. People wouldn't, you'd have gas lines like in the 70s. You wouldn't even have gas lines. You wouldn't even be able to drive your car around.
I was going to say, we've tasted that before in the 70s. That's a lot of what happened in the 70s was the oil embargo, and we created that on ourselves.
Exactly. So I think bringing perspective, all this is really what matters. And this is why we're having this conversation. Nuclear, another one, which is the redheaded stepchild. It's clean, it's cheap, but it's got a negative stigma. How many deaths were attributed to nuclear in the US? I mean, you could argue Chernobyl, but in the US, or even relatively recently anywhere in the world, 0. And we're all afraid of nuclear. It's like people scared the crap out of everybody about nuclear weapons, but when it comes to nuclear energy, everyone's still scared, and there's no reason to be. Even if you look at Fukushima, you say, well, what about Fukushima? All right, how many people died of radiation? Not of like getting a tidal wave hit you and drowning. I mean, actual like from the nuclear plant, zero. So if you look at these statistics, they really shed some light into what's actually going on. And no one has a plan. People just have narratives and agendas. If somebody came out and said, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do, okay, we could argue about that. We could have a discussion about that. We could all agree that, hey, we need to do something by this date, and here's how we're going to do it. And by the way, we're not going to screw over the poor people, because if I was poor, I'd be pissed off if the politicians are doing this. And we have a lot of people in this country who are not wealthy, who are, I'd say they're kind of divided into wealthy. We don't even have a middle class anymore. So it's really kind of rich and poor. But there's a lot of people fall into that poor category who cannot afford doubling their energy costs. So I think you're going to see a lot of people getting really mad over this once they realize what's going on. But of course, they'll never tell the story. They'll just say, "Oh, it wasn't me," and blame it on somebody else. So I think what we really need is good policy decisions and a plan, and somebody who's actually speaking the truth, not this BS that's trying to bamboozle everybody and causing other problems. Like ESG, as if that's going to solve the world's problems. That all that does is that's just people driving power. ESG doesn't do anything from an actual changing of policy or changing energy efficiency or anything. It's just a bunch of people sit in a room and say, "All right, we're gonna take this ESG and we're gonna beat people over the head with it." And there's a reason why people are just done with it, because it's not working. Performance is poor. You got people like, I think it was Larry Fink, who came out and got bombarded with people who are just like, we're going to take our pension money away from you because we don't believe in ESG, and we don't believe in how you're going about it. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth. And I think as long as people are trying to lie to people about the purpose, you're going to have a lot of pushback. If you can have an honest discussion about it, I think you'll get a lot further, because I think people are just drawing lines in the sand, and it's not going to help. So, what are some final thoughts here for you, Doug, as we wrap up here in the interest of time?
Well, I got a good comment that came in. You actually mentioned not in my backyard, and we had a comment from John who talked about, it's not only expensive to change technology, but the issue comes down to that people that want that technology all want to make sure, many of them want to make sure that that technology is implemented, but not where they live, right? Well, the more places we live, the less places there is to implement that technology. So you start looking at pipelines and windmills and nuclear energy and all of these things that people say they want. But then you look at, well, where can we place it? Right? Well, I don't want it here. So I hate to say it, it is either going to be finding places that are currently untapped natural areas that you're now going to, cut down to put it, which is going to make a lot of people unhappy, or you're going to put it in areas of low economic value, which unfortunately affects the poor again. And so it limits, it's a supply and demand issue. We really have a demand for it, but we don't have a supply of places to even put the technology, even if it's affordable. And just kind of take things a little bit on a kind of a lighter scope there, Kirk. I did want to say, you mentioned something about going back to the horses, and I thought it was kind of fun. People can spend a little more time looking this up in the future, on their own for fun. But one thing is just kind of point out, made me think of it, is why do we drive on the left, and why do the British drive on the right? And it comes back to the horses, right? Back in the day, if you think of jousting, most people jousting were right-handed, so they would hold the joust in their right hand. They'd hold their sword in their right hand, and therefore they would drive the horse on the left. And it was also safer to dismount on the left of the horse, away from your enemy. So, of course, now why do we drive on the left? Well, it's because as we got into horses and buggies, the person that riding the horse would sit on the back right horse, and they would they would want to be nearest to the curb so that people could get out. And they would also use their right hand to whip the horses to get them to move. So again, all comes back down to more people right-handed, left-handed fighters and jousters. They just had to deal with it. So of course they would stay closer to the curb because A, they would use their right hand to whip the horses, but B, they'd want faster traffic to go around them. Okay. So ultimately, most of the world actually ended up going, because of chariots and buggies, to left-sided driving. until, and I forget exactly the time frame that happened, but the Brits went back to changing it over to right-handed. So it's a fascinating history to look it up, if you know, because people always wonder, like, why do we drive differently in different parts of the world? And you made me think of it, thinking of horses. And hey, we don't have to always be so dry and serious here, so I figured that'd be kind of fun. But let's just wrap this up. Okay, listen, we know we have an issue to get energy. We need to heat we need to heat, we need electricity. Ultimately, in the end of things, besides direct heating, this is all about electricity. Electricity runs the world. Steam runs turbines. Nuclear generates steam that runs turbines. Wind turns to turn turbines. It's about electricity. It is the ultimate power source. The question is, how do we get the electricity? Do we go to direct electrical storage, direct electrical current? Do we generate, or do we burn, or do things to heat up water to create steam in ways to turn those turbines? It's all about how are we going to turn the turbines. And that is a very, very difficult, a difficult economic and difficult geopolitical path that we're going to continue to be on. And I'm not sure this is ever going to solve itself, Kirk. There's going to have to, I mean, over the time, technologies are changing. 20, 30 years from now, we may be in a situation where things are a lot cheaper and things have changed, exponentially technology's grown, but people need it today. And if we don't start thinking about what we need to fix now and getting away from politically thinking long term, it's going to create a lot of unrest. And we're already starting to see it. So, um, just a little bit more about myself, Kirk, to wrap up today. I'm Douglas Hagren, and I just wanted to kind of mention today one of our businesses. I know we've got some business leaders that are on today. So I'm going to talk about our business. You can find me more about myself and my partner, Craig Coles, at Automatic Business Methods. If you're running a business, the economy is getting tighter, you want to have your business goals get met, and you want to meet them faster and more efficiently, look up more information. Automatic Business Method, help with time problems, team problems, money problems. Simple 9-step way of improving time, team, money problems. No complicated tech, no expensive consultants, and ultimately a business that's going to be so successful, it'll be more valuable, and it'll thrive even if you're not there.
Well, thanks for coming on, Doug. And just wanted to quickly answer Cameron's question: how are you going to mention how are you going to measure Fukushima's impact by how many people died in the short term? I think obviously you could measure that many different ways. I guess my point is that people are not I'm pro nuclear just because I haven't seen any good reason why uh, anyone should be against it. Like any of the objections that people have are old objections from like the 70s that were objections at the time, and maybe they were rational. I don't know, but I know that they're not now, and people are still afraid. So it's almost like people are waiting another 20 years for that generation to die off, so that other people don't have those objections. You got people like Bill Gates who are putting a lot of money behind nuclear, and obviously there's some there's some economic benefit for him if it goes forward. But I think you have some really smart people pushing this, and from a safety standpoint, there haven't been a lot of problems with nuclear. And if you think, yeah, is there a problem with anything? Yeah, but is it due to the energy source, or is it due to just being poorly run? And I think we could always make that argument. But I think not for nothing, the nuclear trend is something that should have discussion at the bare minimum, and it's not even being discussed. It's kind of like this third rail of politics where everyone, I mean, I've talked to people and they're like, yeah, people on the left, people on the right, they agree it's a direction, but nobody wants to talk about it because the other side's just going to use that as a reason to go after them because, oh, nuclear, you're going to kill everybody. I mean, I don't know if you remember Hillary was going with Trump in the election, and she said, "Well, he's gonna blow up the world with a nuclear weapon." Of course, that didn't happen, but that was just that's the way politics work. So I think there's nuclear is kind of this thing that people use to go after each other. So people probably don't want to touch it, but yet it needs to happen. If nothing else, the conversation needs to happen, and people need to start coming up with. There's some great innovative ideas out there, like there's some small portable devices that they can make and manufacture really quickly and easily and bury in the ground, and then when they run out they dig it up and put a new one in. Great, that's an interesting idea, right? Like that's something that we can actually take and try and try out in different levels. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. It was a great question, Cameron, so thanks for pointing that out. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.